Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, recently gave a talk and he answered a question about something that I've personally been very curious about. What's going on with debt, both on the federal government level and the amount of debt that Americans owe. It's a lot, and we're gonna get to the exact numbers in just a minute, but here's what, again, the head of the Federal Reserve had to say about it.
In our economy, we're running an annual deficit of about $1 trillion or more, with 21 or 22 trillion dollars of total indebtedness, internal and external. Are you worried at the Fed about the enormous amount of debt the federal government has?
I'm very worried about it. But from the Fed standpoint, we're really looking at a business cycle kind of length. That's our frame of reference. And the long run fiscal non-sustainability of the US federal government isn't really something that plays into the next, the sort of medium term that is relevant for our policy decisions. It's a long run issue that we definitely need to face, and ultimately will have no choice but to face.
So if you had a difficult time understanding what he was talking about there, have no fear, because Nomi Prince is here and she is an expert. Used to work on, it does rhyme. Used to work on Wall Street, and you just wrote a book called Collusion that actually does talk a little bit about something called quantitative easing, which we'll get to in just a minute. But unpack that for us.
Okay, so I'm just gonna step back without. I might include numbers. Actually, I
should.
Numbers will happen. So one of the reasons we have amassed so much extra debt over the last decade is because 10 years ago, after the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve decided that it would be a really good idea to help the banks that caused the crisis. In order to help the banks that caused the crisis, who are running out of money to pay for their errors, the Fed decided to make money really cheap. Lowered rates to 0% for banks, not for real humans, for banks. Banks got to get money at 0%, i.e. for free, because the Fed effectively created money from electronic gadgets.
They just printed money.
They didn't print it. They just, they didn't even take the actual physical effort of printing. It was like click, right? It was little clicks on a thing. So when that happened, and when money became cheap, that wasn't enough for the Fed to help the banks. The system was so screwed up financially because of the larger banks in our country, and therefore globally, because they're all sort of interrelated, that the Fed needed to do something else. I'm gonna jump to quantitative easing, it's all related. They did something called quantitative easing, which is a wonky way of saying they needed to make money cheap, not just for 3 months to give the banks, which they have jurisdiction over, 3-month interest rates at 0. They said, we're gonna buy treasuries. And by buying treasuries that are 5 years long and 7 years long and 10 years long, out of money that's created out of electronic ether sphere, they basically were able to reduce the cost of money throughout all of these time periods. The relationship is I buy treasuries, they have demand, the prices go up, the rates go down. So now banks can equally go out and use this cheap money and the fact that rates are low to lend money to their corporate clients. What do they get from that? They get fees, they get to be cool and be involved in the IPOs, they get to be involved in shares, they get nice, sort of access to Washington and all sorts of other things. Because of that, the Fed actually enabled extra debt to be created. Money was so cheaply available to banks that banks were able to lend it cheaply to their friends and to each other.
Right.
As a result, 60% of the debt has basically increased because of the Fed's creation of this plan. So it is ironic that Jerome Powell is sitting there and saying, I'm concerned about the debt, but not really, because if the Fed had not made rates so low, the government would not have been able to create as much debt as cheaply at those low rates. And if the Fed didn't buy those government bonds from banks, which they did, and put them on their balance sheet out of money they created from nowhere, that debt would not have increased as much. It is the Fed's policy's fault that debt has increased by so much. So to say he's not really paying attention, it's but that's what you did.
That's exactly right.
That was all you.
Okay, so again, total US debt is about $21.9 trillion, of which 16 trillion is owed by the public. And so what was you mentioned how the Federal Reserve gets involved, they wanna help the banks after they've made all these disastrous decisions that led to the economic meltdown. But wasn't the original idea to lend that money to small businesses and to Americans?
That was the story.
Right. That was what we were lied to about.
If banks do better, then therefore they'll give that money on it. If we give them money with like no strings attached, then they are going to, out of their own spirit of kindness to the American public and small businesses and towns like Ojai, California, where I live, they'll just sort of happen. That didn't happen. What banks did was say, hey, you're giving us really cheap and free money. Awesome, we're gonna buy our stock. We're gonna pay ourselves. We're gonna do all these other things. That's why the Fed actually helped banks enrich themselves. They helped a lot of financial assets rise by their policy of reducing rates. It didn't go to individuals. It didn't go to small businesses, which is, as a result of that, why consumers actually had to borrow more, like actual individuals in small business at higher rates more expensively, putting them more at risk, because this money specifically did not go through the banks to them. It went through the banks to the banks.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.